Does sitting in the armchair and just thinking about consciousness, can you get anywhere? Well, I've just read Tim Bain's article in which he looks at Tononi and others' integrated information theory.
Yeah, the axioms of IIT. Yeah.
Exactly. And I read that, and I see it as a very good sort of piece clarifying whether these genuinely are axioms and whether the deductions are genuinely deductions. But of course, I don't at the end find the solution to consciousness at the end of the article.
Right.
So what he's done is a very, very good job, because philosophers are trained to think very clearly and they're trained in logic. So let's get back to consciousness. Does a training in logic help us understand consciousness? Well, the alternative is to study it. So I'm comparing sitting in the armchair thinking about it as opposed to getting into the lab and doing experiments. So let's take one of the experiments that Tononi did. Well, he showed that as you wake up, what happens in the brain is that areas that were not talking to each other, not communicating with each other, begin to communicate with each other. That's where the integration comes from. And he did an experiment using transcranial magnetic brain stimulation, which showed this effect. And there are other people in Oxford who've shown that as you go to sleep, so areas stop talking to one another, and so on. So experiments are beginning to tell us something about what happens when we go from sleep to wake or wake to sleep. And then there are experiments, of course, in which you present stimuli which people either do see or only see sometimes because they're very dim or whatever, and you look to see what happens in the brain when they see something as opposed to when they don't see it, when they miss it. And we know from recent experiment by Stander in Paris that if you look in the brain in a monkey, these are macaque monkeys, and you compare the first visual area to which vision, cortical area to which vision projects, and then a later one called V4, and then prefrontal cortex. So he's recording in these three areas, and he's recording with electrodes. And you compare what are called hits with misses. So the monkey's asked to detect targets, and it presses a button when it detects a target. And of course, some of the targets it will detect, and some, because they're dim, they'll miss. And you can compare hits with misses. And if you look in primary visual cortex or the visual area V4, on the whole, there's not very much difference in the activity. But you look in prefrontal cortex, and there's very little activity for misses. In other words, what's happening in prefrontal cortex seems to be closer to what you and I are aware of than is activity earlier in the system. Now, those are the sorts of experiments that seem to me to begin to tell us something about consciousness. And my worry is what is sitting in the armchair going to do? Now, of course, a philosopher could say to me, well, look, as a philosopher, I'm trained to think logically. And my reply to that is, I can think logically. You don't need to tell me. Why can't I do that thinking? Where is the room for somebody to just do the thinking?
Right. No, I think that's a very important point. I wonder if I could kind of press you a little bit on this and follow up. So I think you're kind of unique with this philosophical background that you have as a scientist. I don't know a lot of scientists who were doing psychology and philosophy at the same time. And I think maybe there's a risk of especially when it comes to consciousness, but with the mind in general, I think there's a risk of people thinking they're experts already because they have a mind, they are conscious. Yes. And so there's a risk of scientists sort of taking their naive pre-theoretical assumptions about what these phenomena are. I think Tononi's an special example of this kind of thing because he starts with these axioms, which really just encode his pre-theoretical intuitions about consciousness. This is how he thinks of the phenomena as being unified, having cause and effect power, all that kind of stuff. So without doing the training first of being very clear about what assumptions are, what justifies assumptions, which I don't think scientists are really taught, to be honest, there's this, you run the risk of importing your naive assumptions into your science. Do you think that that's a fair characterization or no?
I think my challenge is, tell me one thing that a philosopher has found about consciousness.
Well, I mean, so is it that they have to find something, or can't they just contribute to clear thinking about it so that others can be clear about what they're looking for?
Why can't I think clearly? Now, you're saying Tononi doesn't think clearly, and now Tononi, he probably was a mathematician or what? I don't know what his training was. Do you know?
Yeah, it's not that I'm not saying, well, I do, but it's not that I'm saying that he doesn't think clearly because I've met him. I know he thinks very clearly, but what I'm saying is that there's a danger in importing assumptions and taking them as kind of bedrock because, you know, he has conscious experience and his experience, it seems this way to him. So then he goes and tries to formalize that into some kind of axioms, but the axioms are really, they aren't axioms in the sense that you find in mathematics or logic. They're just assumptions about the way consciousness works, which would also need to be tested, not empirically and not used as the starting point of constructing a test.
Yeah, I think, I mean, I don't have any sympathy with the way Tononi is going about it. As I say, I would much prefer the sorts of experiments, very simple experiments that I've been talking about.
Right.
And I'll come to one critical one in a minute. In other words, I think Tononi did do an experiment very early on, which showed that areas communicate with each other when we become aware as we go from sleep to waking. And I think that was important. But many other people are working on communication between areas and in different states. I wouldn't want to try to study consciousness by setting up a set of axioms in the way he is. I would simply want to do some very simple experiments, like ask where in the brain is the activity closest to what the person reports. Now, I've told you that the answer to that from the Stan Daines experiment is it looks in a monkey as if it's the prefrontal cortex. Now, there's a very simple test. If that were true, and if prefrontal cortex were removed from both hemispheres, the question is, would the monkey be aware? And the question is, can we test that? Now, Alan Cowie and Petra Starry did an experiment with monkeys, and it went like this. They taught the monkey, if you see a light, touch it on the screen. If there's no light, touch a square. And then they removed the visual cortex from one hemisphere. And that means that the monkey couldn't see anything on the opposite side of space. They then tested that the monkey still knows the rule. So if you present in the space which the monkey can see, because that's supported by the intact hemisphere, if you present a dot, the monkey touches it. If there's no dot, the monkey presses the square. So the monkey still knows the rule. Now, if you present the spot in the blind part of space, quotes, the monkey always presses the square. He always says, he, that she doesn't see it. So we have a way of asking the animal, did you see it? So if prefrontal cortex were critical for awareness, and if we removed prefrontal cortex, in principle, it ought to be possible to ask the monkey this way, whether it sees things. Now, a long time ago, in 1962, Pat Goldman, as she then was, did remove prefrontal cortex in both hemispheres in monkeys. And they could still discriminate between visual stimuli. That is, they could tell the difference between a plus and a square. Mm-hmm. And they were not blind, by which I mean they didn't bump into things. So the question is, does that show that you don't need prefrontal cortex for awareness? Or, as Hak-Wan Lau thinks, were in fact these monkeys showing what Larry Weisskranz called blind sight? In other words, the ability to do the task while actually you're not aware of the stimuli. Mm-hmm. So I haven't found a way. I'm sort of trying to move to a way of trying to find, I'm not going to do this experiment, but I'm thinking now, what would the experiment be that would tell us whether you needed prefrontal cortex for awareness? Because as you know, in the field, there is a dispute between whether it's sufficient to have activity in early visual areas, or whether you also need to have activity in prefrontal cortex.
Right.
And a critical test would be, what would happen if you had no prefrontal cortex? Now, I don't see in this sort of conversation how philosophy is going to contribute. Except in the following way. It worries me in the experiment that Alan Cowie and Petra Starry did it's very easy to conclude that what the monkey was doing was telling you something about its awareness. But what it may have been doing is simply telling you something about the external world.
Right.
And saying there wasn't a spot. So that brings up the issue of whether by awareness we mean what we call metacognition. Do we mean, when we say that we're aware, that we are aware of that? So we know that Hackward Lau, with a philosopher, wrote a paper on metacognitive theories of awareness. And that's an example where, a philosopher, I think, did contribute to the issue of how should we define awareness? Does it necessarily involve metacognition or not?